Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Security Law Journal and the Immigration Law Society's Spring Symposium, Borders and Beyond, the Future of American Border Security. Thank informative and innovative commentary on national security law issues that contributes to the legal community. Each year, we also host 2 symposia to foster discussion around pressing and relevant national security topics such as this one. The topic of border security has become a main talking point as we enter this election year. However, it is not just a talking point. It is a dynamic, multifaceted topic that has not just political facets, but also legal and humanitarian. It is our hope that this symposium will assist in fostering discussion about the many aspects of border security, including that each individual walk away with a new perspective or additional knowledge to encourage more civil, professional, and informed discussions about border security in our daily lives. At this time, I would also like to introduce our amazing co-hosts of this symposium, the Immigration Law Society. The Immigration Law Society is a student organization here at Scalia Law, whose purpose is to give students who are interested in the field of immigration law an opportunity to take part in activities and to network with practitioners. Their insight and contribution to this symposium has been monumental, and it has been a pleasure to work with such fantastic people. I also want to take a quick moment to thank the individuals who helped to make this event possible. Thank you to the National Security Law Journal Executive Board and the Immigration Law Society's Executive Board. In particular, thank you to the National Security Law Journal members, Gabriella Hensinger, our managing editor, Parker Bowman, our symposium editor, and incoming managing editor, Danielle Saman. And thank you to Immigration Law Society members Brian Min and Ariel Singer, co-presidents, Francesca Romiliano, Vice President of Media and Outreach, and Zion Godfrey, co-vice president of events. Their hard work is clearly evident, and their dedication to the National Security Law Journal and the Immigration Law Society's missions are truly inspiring. It has been an honor to work alongside all of you. Lastly, thank you to everyone here for being a part of this symposium, for contributing to the discussion, and for supporting the National Security Law Journal and the Immigration Law Society. Following the panel, we invite everyone to join us for a reception in the art gallery just behind the auditorium. I would now like to welcome Brian Min, co-president of the Immigration Law Society, to the stage to introduce our speakers for the evening. Thank you.
Good evening. I think we're all excited to hear about the future of American border security. Let me introduce our moderator, Stephanie Groff. Currently serves as a trial attorney with the Department of Justice's Office of Immigration Litigation Appellate Section. She represents the Attorney General before the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in civil immigration litigation. She's also an adjunct professor at the Antonin Scalia Law School who teaches immigration law and law journal management. Ms. Groff previously worked as an associate legal advisor with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement's Office of the Principal Legal Advisor in the Immigration Law and Practice Division. Additionally, she clerked at the Los Angeles Immigration Court through the Attorney General's Honors Program. She received her BA from the University of Maryland and her JD from Antonin Scalia Law School. Let me introduce our first panelist, James McCament. He is currently the Acting Chief Operating Officer for U.S. Customs and Border Protection and an adjunct professor here at the Antonin Scalia Law School. In his role as Acting Chief Operating Officer, Mr. McCament ensures the front line is equipped with the personnel, tools, and vital information needed, improving the agency's capacity to adapt and respond to an ever-changing environment. Mr. McCament is also a founding civil service member of the Department of Homeland Security and has served in multiple leadership roles since DHS was founded in March 2003. He previously served as the Deputy Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, where he was responsible for overseeing agency operations, a budget of over $4 billion, more than 200 offices, and 19,000 employees. Prior to serving as U.S. CIS Deputy Director, he also served in the Office of the U.S. CIS Director in roles of Acting Chief of Staff and Acting Deputy Chief of Staff, Chief of the U.S. CIS Office of Legislative Affairs, as the DHS Field Office Director in Havana, Cuba, as Senior Counselor to the Director of USCIS, as Special Advisor to DHS Secretaries Tom Ridge and Michael Chertoff, and as an attorney and founding member of the DHS Office of General Counsel. Mr. McCament received his Juris Doctor from the University of Notre Dame Law School and his bachelor's degree from Mount Vernon Nazarene College. Let me introduce our second panelist, Julia Myers-Wood. She has more than 25 years of experience in the public and private sector working on regulatory and enforcement issues from many perspectives, including serving as a federal prosecutor, defense counsel, government investigator, and compliance consultant. Ms. Wood is currently the Chief Executive Officer at Guidepost Solutions, a leading investigations, compliance, and security firm with offices throughout the United States, as well as England, Colombia, and Singapore. She also currently serves on National Security Institute Advisory Board here at Scalia Law. Prior to joining the private sector, Ms. Wood held several high-level positions with the U.S. government, including at the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, Treasury, and Commerce, as well as the White House. In one of her most significant government roles, Ms. Wood served as Assistant Secretary and Head of Immigration and Customs Enforcement for the Department of Homeland Security, the largest investigative component and the second largest investigative agency in the federal government. Ms. Wood is nationally recognized as a speaker for her expertise on immigration and other law enforcement issues. She has testified before Congress numerous times and has appeared on CNN, C-SPAN, ABC, CNBC, MSNBC, NPR, Fox, and other broadcast stations. Our third panelist, Cart Weiland, is Senior Counsel on the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Foreign Affairs, where he covers the State Department's global operations and management and assists Chairman Michael McCall on oversight matters. Previous to this role, he served as a member of the State Department's Office of Policy Planning under Secretary Mike Pompeo, where he covered Latin American issues and served as rapporteur on the U.S. Commission on Unalienable Rights. Earlier, he served as speechwriter to Secretary Pompeo, as well as chief speechwriter to then Majority Whip of the U.S. Senate John Cornyn. He has also worked as a policy analyst for a state-level think tank, practiced regulatory litigation at a Texas law firm, and clerked on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. He is a graduate of Duke University and Harvard Law School. He also serves as an adjunct professor in the Department of Politics at the Catholic University of America. Why don't we give a warm welcome to our panelists today?
Great, thank you so much for having us. Before we begin, just your typical disclosure, as I work in the federal government, everything that I say or that we say is our own opinions and not necessarily representing the view of where we work. So just a fun disclosure to start. But before we begin, I do want to kind of dive deep into the history of border security and specifically the Department of Homeland Security. So both Julie and James, you were there at the beginning and the founding of the Department of Homeland Security. If you're able, can you share a bit about this experience and delve into some of the concerns that were present there as it relates to border security at the time?
Sure. Well, I'll give a couple of top lines that came to mind. That border security with respect to the visa process. So at the time, there were strong concerns about the amount of time it was taking to get visas, the national security screening that needed to be involved. So that was certainly one aspect where we dove in to try to see some modifications and improvements. And for the border, particularly the numbers. At that time, I think we were 200,000 or 300,000 in 2003 for the year.
Not for the month.
Not for the month. For those of you maybe tracking some of the numbers, it's much closer to by the month now. And that led to strong emphasis on comprehensive immigration reform under President Bush, and seeking to try to make adjustments in the legal processing and also in the undocumented immigrants programs, temporary worker programs, and then control of the border. And at that time, I remember particularly sort of the drumbeat of 100% control of the border was a big mantra.
And I think there was so much concern kind of post 9/11 about all the failures of a broken immigration law enforcement system and how the different agencies were not working together, how the Customs Service was not working effectively with the Immigration Service, and how that led to some of the greatest failures. And so really looking to see how could you give the Immigration Service more of these national security authorities, how can you make sure that Customs is aware of the immigration authorities and working together, and those were really big drivers. And you could see at the founding of DHS, aggressive actions taken on the national security front because the memories of 9/11 were so fresh and the concerns about the failings within the Immigration Service and the Customs Service and others were so clear. And all of us who were there, before 9/11 did not want another 9/11 right, to occur.
Right.
And so there was a real aggressiveness in the creation in trying to put the agencies together in a way that could protect America.
Absolutely, and one thing that we do talk about in my immigration law class is that some of the terrorists from 9/11 did have student visas, visitor visas, and so was a bit of lapse in the discussion that maybe they kind of slipped through the cracks. So border security, James mentioned that numbers now are very intense and have increased with those coming into the United States. Can you guys discuss how it's evolved over the years since the creation of DHS? What are some of the trends that we're seeing at the border, and especially what are the trends that the government or other factors are concerned for safety and national security?
There's a lot to cover in that. So I think some of the trends over time, so the numbers continue to increase, and that's an understatement of it, but it's also an emphasis that with each administration, there have been actions, policies seeking to try to redirect the flow, and what we've seen is both an increase in the volume, and that's resulted in enhancement on growing the Border Patrol, for example, multiple times, and it's also increased in certain types of authorities being given for interdiction. And I think also a big element has been the use of technology as well, and binational cooperation. Back in the Bush administration, President Bush at that time signing the Merida Initiative, for example, was really the first border security binational security cooperation agreement framed on a mutual problem. So it was the idea of the cartels and an increase in trafficking. So those were some of the solutions, and I think also as we look at pretty dramatic shifts in the demographics in the Obama administration, not because it was the Obama administration, but because it was in 2014 that we saw basically a misalignment between the structure of our border system geared towards single adult males, predominantly from Mexico, coming for work, and then an evolution from that into the families, and more often seeking asylum. Sometimes asylum provides a work authorization, but it was more centrally focused on asylum. So those are some top lines.
Yeah, and in terms of demographics, not only the types of individuals or families showing up, but where they hail from as well. So you mentioned Mexico. I think as of a decade or two ago, Mexico was the typical migrant at the border was from there. Whereas these days, you've got Chinese nationals, you've got Haitians, you've got Nicaraguans, you've got Venezuelans, you've got Ukrainians. I mean, it's a much more mixed bag in terms of where folks are coming from.
And when they're coming from all these different places, it makes it much more difficult to return them home. And
Right.
so when individuals are coming in without authorization from Mexico, often they can be turned right around. Sometimes coming back in the same night, right? But they can be turned right around often on the border or deported very easily. Also with many other countries in Central and Latin America, not so with Venezuela, not so with China, not so with other places. It's more expensive, it's more difficult. They often don't have documents. And so that puts additional strain on our immigration system. And I do want to add to James's point about the number of families and the unaccompanied minors that are coming through. What I'm seeing in the private sector is the number of underage, unauthorized kids that are working without authorization in very dangerous occupations. And I didn't see that 10 years ago when I was out working in these same high risk, with these same high risk companies and the same meat packers and retailers and others. You didn't see the same problems that you see today because of the vast number of these unaccompanied youth that are coming in, and they need money, they need to work, and they're going into these dangerous jobs, and they're putting them at risk. But before we started, I actually said, James and I are old friends from the Bush administration, but I said I would pull out my talking points from 2008 because not much has changed, right? The numbers have changed, but the fundamental problem and the fundamental inability of our country to control who's coming in and to manage who's coming in and to know who's coming in and to regulate who's leaving has not changed. And so we try different things in different administrations, but we continue to fail, and just kind of more spectacularly, administration after administration.
And one thing that James mentioned, and maybe you all three can talk about, is technology. How can technology be utilized, especially with national security concerns, in protecting and securing our borders? A lot of people don't realize how much technology DHS has, DHS utilizes, but if you guys could speak on that, or what you would maybe even like to see happen to make it more secure. Maybe not you, James, but the other
This
panelists.
is where I use my same footnote as Stephanie. Well, I do think a top line on technology is the ability to identify, both identification and interdiction, more interdiction between the ports of entry, of course, for the Border Patrol, our integrated surveillance towers, the aerostats, the drones that have been used for a while. I mean, this goes back at the tail end of the Bush administration and the SBI, Secure Border Initiative, net, to create a virtual fence. We were looking at technology then. But I think it centers on that idea, or at least a portion of it, on the identification, and then also how that leads to interdiction, or if you're at the port of entry, being able to identify someone who shouldn't be there and turn them around before they cross through the port of entry.
And I think a fundamental question is the government going to use all the data and knowledge that the private sector has in order to identify individuals who are unauthorized or are posing a criminal risk or a national security risk? And that, I think there's a lot of tension there, right? There's a lot of concerns about the government using data that the private sector already has and is already using just to make sure that I shop at Target instead of, another store, right? But if the government uses it, it raises perhaps additional concerns.
Right.
And so I think this will be a really interesting time as technology continues to ramp up. It's like, what is the government allowed to do versus what is the private sector already doing to target people in different ways?
And it's also, the technology question is not just one that relates to our own government and our own border. It also, you have to widen the lens a bit and talk about what technology is being shared with other countries when it comes to the migration crisis. One thing the State Department right now does a lot of is quote unquote capacity building in other countries like Mexico, and part of that involves sharing technology and other resources with local law enforcement and local NGOs in those countries to do things like screening and increase their ability to detect narcotics in certain scenarios, and buttress their judicial systems to prosecute illegal immigration cases and smuggling cases and that sort of thing. And so a lot of what colloquially we talk about root causes of migration, a lot of that is being addressed, or we're attempting to address it through foreign assistance programs that are administered by the State Department, and there is a technology component of all those programs.
But I think the point about sharing between governments is a point where there's been so much progress over the last 5 years in terms of kind of sharing all kinds of information that would affect duties and imports and other things. It used to be that a lot of people wouldn't declare duty on things that they had received the EU credit tax credit back for. Don't do that anymore, because as soon as you take that EU credit, the VAT tax back, that the information is going to be sent, and CBP is going to be waiting for you to declare that you bought that fancy Gucci purse. And if not, they're going to march you back to secondary. So it's that kind of technology to protect our fiscal borders, right? That they're also doing with respect to people. The other thing that I would note on the data and the sharing is that I don't think the government is doing a perfect job yet in terms of putting people on lists or taking people off of lists and managing that in an ineffective way. And when I was in government, if somebody got on a list, we're like, oh, they're on a list, there must be good cause for them to be on a list. That's not always the case. And the process for getting off, whether it's a no-fly list or if your global entry is revoked, is not transparent, it's not clear, it's problematic. And so that can be very difficult. And I know the government's made some progress, and I don't envy them for what they're doing, but I think it's very tough, and it makes it harder to manage our borders when there's a feeling that we don't control it well.
I think that's a fair point, because I think also as the technology has enhanced our ability to share information, move around, I think it's fair to say our own processes for sort of adjustments they are not as nimble. Yeah. And so that creates sometimes the mystery. Now being at CBP,
now you can fix it.
Right. Oh, sure. That was actually where I was going with that. Right. Exactly. The questions received even on global entry cases is often, but I don't understand. And I think that part of our challenge as well across the border apparatus is we want to have as much clarity in the process as possible. And as we're screening, we're not trying to give away national security frameworks, but to the extent that someone is able to come through, cross, and enter who is allowed to, who has been screened, the faster they can do that and the clearer that process is for them, the more that we may be able to devote our efforts towards national security interdiction, right? So as our volume goes up, it may not be that the percentage of those who are trying to come into the country and commit harm goes up, but by sheer number it will. And so when we can zero in the national security screening and let the rest of the process move as rapidly as possible, it inures to our benefit. And we are very much not there, to Julie's point. But I think that's one of the goals we want to focus on as we use technology.
And I think one thing that's really important, just to remind everyone, that border doesn't always refer to Canada and the United States and Mexico and the United States, that ports of entry, both land and sea, so airports, maybe Miami, you're coming off of a cruise ship, those to the federal government are also viewed as border, as ports, where you have CBP officers, you have investigatives, making sure that whoever is coming in or out of our country knows exactly what's happening and to be as safe as possible.
And to your point, Stephanie, we have, for CBP, it controls the ports of entry, and we have 326 ports of entry. On an average day in 2023, I think I have this right, we had around 890,000 people crossing the ports of entry on a daily basis. Now, that's legally, or at least seeking to come in, trying to turn around, but when you put those numbers in context, it's an enormous flow in addition to those that are coming between the ports of entry, that the 200,000 to 300,000 we were talking about a month are those between the ports of entry, as best as we can calculate.
Yeah, and I want to ask, Cart, you had previously worked for the Department of State, and you already talked a bit about cooperative agreements with other countries, specifically in Latin America. I was wondering if you could talk about your experience during the Trump administration. The State Department and the Department of Homeland Security worked with Latin American countries to help combat or stop the intense migration of people that may have crossed the border illegally. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. I think the State Department's role in migration policy writ large is sort of an untold story. A lot of people, rightfully look to DHS, but state has a major role to play, and I would point to sort of two broad areas. The first is they administer foreign aid, which at times is sort of destined for Latin American countries from which a lot of migrants hail. And the intent of that aid is to sort of deal with root causes of migration and or support various actors on the government or the non-governmental side who are dealing with the processing of or law enforcement sort of investigations of migrant or sort of related issues like smuggling and narco trafficking and that sort of thing. So foreign assistance is one way that state is sort of in the migration game, so to speak. But the other probably bigger realm is, State Department is our government's diplomatic arm, and so they have to negotiate agreements with foreign countries involving migration. So under the past administration, you saw agreements like Remain in Mexico, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, as well as the asylum cooperative agreements with 3 Central American countries. The idea behind them was that the US government wanted to build asylum capacity in Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala, so that folks who traditionally would apply for asylum in the US could instead apply for asylum in those countries. Those were ultimately reneged by Biden for a variety of reasons, which we don't probably have time to get into. But the point is that, regardless of what your migration policy is going to be under a given administration, there's always going to be a diplomatic part of that because agreements have to be signed. And an example that was given earlier by this panel was this whole idea of like, okay, let's say in a perfect world we get our act together on the US side and could suddenly have, a secure border through which no, illegal crossings occur. Well, you'd still have to figure out what to do with all the folks who show up at the border that do not have a legal basis to enter. Like, how are you going to get them back to the countries from which they hail? Well, you have to negotiate agreements with foreign countries to do that. So there are things like repatriation flights, which require detailed negotiations with the relevant foreign governments. How are you going to get, this group of 100 folks from, let's say, Colombia? How are you going to transport them physically from, northern Mexico back to Colombia? And there are different categories of folks within that. Like Colombia may be less inclined to accept a convicted felon than it would be, a mom and her young daughter, So there are all these delicate nuances involved, but obviously diplomacy plays a big role in all of that. So hopefully that helps.
Definitely, and I'll echo, as Cart, you were saying, that some of the complexities of that work are far more complicated. Complexities and they're complicated, right? But it's this, and that they are not just set in stone once you get the agreement. So even when we negotiated the asylum cooperative agreements, obviously those were later taken down, but the amount of negotiation and what State Department had to do, what DHS had to do, in just going, it really felt at times like inch by inch, which is understandable from the other country's perspective in a way. But the repatriation flights as well are, and that goes back to our time when you were the head of ICE, Julie, is you'll negotiate, and the parameters, as you mentioned, composition, and during COVID, different COVID testing regimes, we will take them, we won't take them. The next week we're changing back again. And it's just almost in perpetual motion, for which we always have to we need that diplomatic partnership on the ground, and then are almost always engaging. Almost seems like a weekly basis, trying to get the flights up or back and adjust.
And that then causes frustration to be built up when sometimes the worst criminals are the ones that we can't send back home, and it is the mom with her kid that's kind of boarded first on the flight, and people feel like, hey, this is not fair, this is not just, this is not right, and it's not. And so that is why I think there's a lot of frustration that's continued from the American people about what are we going to do and how are we going to solve this. And it's not, unfortunately, it's not an easy problem, and that people from all different sides want something, but it's not clear, how much they're going to push forward to get to a good end point. And so that, I think it's a really challenging thing. I think the repatriation flights is an important point. The other thing I would note about the State Department is consular affairs. In countries, and that's kind of a rite of passage when you go into the State Department. Often your first job is consular affairs, so it's not, with apologies to all the great ambassadors who started there, sometimes, you're in there as your junior job and you're anxious to get out, right? But if you have a good consular affairs team in a country, that can make all the difference in terms of the effectiveness in the country, whether or not people feel like the immigration system is working there. If they're turned down to come to the U.S. for reasons they don't understand, they can think, hey, this country's not right. I need to come in a way without authorization. I need to do something that's irregular. It can be really tough. So I think consular affairs often is not given the support it needs and the kudos it needs for really being a really important part of keeping us safe, both on letting people come and on keeping people out that might, not have the right reasons to come to the U.S. or may intend to stay in the U.S. once they come.
If I could just add one last thought about the Latin America piece. I think you all are aspiring lawyers. We often in America think of, border security as something our legal system has to figure out in a vacuum. But what makes it even more complicated is actually that lawmaking in other countries affects what happens on our border. So for example, Mexico, as of a couple years ago, I haven't studied it recently to know if it's still the case, had a law in the books that prohibited the detention of minors, period, which complicated the US's ability to send back minors into Mexico because the Mexican government would say, well, we don't have anywhere to put them because we can't detain these, Venezuelans or whoever in our country because it's against the law. That's just one example. Another example is, for example, in Central America, there's a treaty known as the CA4 agreement that requires free movement through all of the Northern Triangle countries. So let's just say that border officials in a country like Nicaragua, this would never happen given that country, but let's just say they wanted to clamp down on folks moving northward through that area of the world before they got to Mexico. Well, this treaty prohibits that sort of operation from happening, which means that Mexico is sort of being squeezed because all these folks coming from South America and Central America cannot be stopped before they reach Mexico because of the law on the books. So those are just two small examples of how both other countries' legal systems and international law affect U.S. border policy and law writ large.
And I think that example, particularly on the C4, demonstrates the need for the regional approach and the strategies that I know when the ACAs were being negotiated, that was raised by both Guatemala and by Honduras. And the challenge, if I recall correctly as well, is that the C4 had to be redone by all the legislative bodies. So if one wanted to change a portion, the other three would have to sanction it and approve it in their legislature, even if it didn't impact them directly. And it sort of binds your hands internationally in trying to maneuver with that. But as you said, it's not well known or well stated. And I think we all kind of walked into it when we realized that was going to be the impact.
Oh, wow, this is complicated.
Right.
Well, and on that note, too, there has not been a lot of immigration reform in U.S. Congress for many years. How are you hopeful that there could be a bipartisan agreement that could not only bring about immigration and statute change, but also address everything happening in our U.S. borders? Do you think that's something that could be possible?
Sure, which one of us should
I'm
start?
not hopeful. I work in Congress right now. I'm not super hopeful. I mean, I will say there are admirable efforts at comprehensive immigration reform. Representative Maria Salazar of Florida has introduced a bill this Congress known as the Dignity Act. It's like 300 or 400 pages. She's from a purple district. She's got Democratic and Republican co-sponsors. Like she's doing really good work. It's just it's the topic of immigration is just so toxic in Congress that it's really hard for something that big and sort of far-reaching to gain traction when there are so many more pressing issues that have to be dealt with that can be handled sort of more discreetly and more quickly. I don't begrudge her for trying. Under the current environment, I don't see a scenario where a comprehensive immigration reform is politically doable. But perhaps my colleagues here will disagree. And if so, I'd love to hear that news.
We were talking about a point, I think, and Julie, you led with that. To mention the feel of immigration now in the general political landscape.
It's very difficult, and sometimes you think that no one wants a solution, right. that there are people that are so invested in their side, whatever it is, that they're not going to come together. I had kind of hoped when things got really worse that would actually raise the attention and we would get some comprehensive immigration reform, but that doesn't seem to have moved the needle. So I'm not sure what will. If the current just immense border crisis is not moving the needle, if the numbers of people that where you can't find enough people to work, if that's not moving the needle, I don't know kind of what will. So I think maybe something piecemeal again, right? And again, maybe more in the executive branch, right? When in the Bush administration, we thought you couldn't do much.
Right.
We now we know that was not true, but that's what we
Right.
thought at the time. We thought we could not take very many steps. Obama went further, Trump went further, Biden has gone even further, and now the states are going further, right?
Yeah.
So that may be the way we're going to have immigration reform. I don't know if it's reform, but immigration action.
I think it may well be. I mean, if you think the years, it's 2005, 7, 9,
Yeah.
13, and then attempts in 17 and 19. It's not always the odd years, but it seems to sort of shake that way. But I think to both your points, I'm not sure now that if you ask someone on either side, I think, what do you think needs done? I feel that there are probably quite a few in Congress and outside who would say, well, you need X, Y, and Z. So that there isn't necessarily a complete obfuscation of what some of the solutions might be, but the ability to come together and try to get that. And in a comprehensive way, I'm reminded back at the time of the 2005, we were in some consultations with the Spanish government when I was in USCIS. And during an after event, one of the ministers said, you know, having the EU and Spain having recently passed immigration reform at that time, do you know what the problem is with you Americans in immigration reform? Which is always an interesting kickoff, right? And this is so many years ago. But it resonates because he said, you always attempt to do something comprehensively in your Congress, and you never seem to be able to get exactly what you need. And at the time, I really thought, okay, well, I appreciate that, but we'll try again. Well, now, many years later, I think there probably is a point that the piecemeal elements, which can be enormous, are probably partly the way, but the progression now from the legislative to the executive, and now as the states pick up again in a way they haven't since, I think, SB 1070, does indicate some recognition in the system that some different approach needs to be had, whether it's going to be the states taking on executive more, but I think it's a signal in the system. It's just a resonant. It's not going to happen the way we would like.
Yeah, and it's ever changing. I mean, even today, if some of you aren't aware, the Supreme Court ruled on Texas's action in border
I need a
enforcement and Border Patrol, and SB 170 was Arizona back in 2012.
Ruled on in
2010,
2012.
I believe it came about, and that's something that we talk about in our class in immigration law is what is the power of the executive, what is the power of the states. Now, without necessarily commenting on your view of the legality of what Texas is doing, could you guys speak to what you can see envisioning happening? Is it going to be more than Texas? Can you see non-border states, maybe Utah, other places starting to get involved in immigration, or is that not something that you see happening?
I mean, absolutely. I think other states will kind of follow the bandwagon if the Supreme Court ultimately kind of upholds what Texas is doing. And I say that based on my experience in the Bush administration, where we had a program, 287G, where the states could be a part of it. And we were flooded with applications, and we couldn't really manage it because it's not just arresting someone who's here without authorization. It's then making sure they can go through the system in the appropriate way, that they get the process that they're entitled to, that then if they're ordered removed, then they're deported, all of that. And so the state can only play kind of one tiny piece, but absolutely will they want to, and I think we will see that, and I think there could be then some significant problems in the civil rights arena and other things, and so that's why we were always very cognizant of giving special training on the civil rights and civil liberties and to make sure that these officers acted appropriately. I do want to say one thing though, I really want to applaud the men and women who are at Homeland Security in CBP and Border Patrol and ICE and USCIS. It's such a difficult job, and they get so little recognition, right? And I know they're recruiting now. They're recruiting for lawyers still, right? So there's plenty of opportunity. If you are interested in the immigration arena,
Stop by my
hire.
class.
they're hiring.
Talk to
They are
Professor
hiring.
Groff.
But it's important to recognize
Yes.
what a hard job they have. And now they're going to be faced with kind of state and local saying, hey, you're not doing a good enough job, so we had to step up. And so I really want to kind of thank them for what they're doing. And
Well, on their behalf, Julie, I'll say thank you for that, because I think that one of the unsung parts is when an agent, officer, in any of those agencies is out in their world and in their role, they often are one or two or three. I mean, when they have an encounter, they have to be cognizant of all the different parameters. And so whether weighing in on which side or not, that complicates more when you're balancing, and certainly Border Patrol and CBP has had that recently in Texas, and trying to navigate, which by the way is not necessarily always a combative point, but it is genuinely how they're trying to follow the different authorities. One other quick point I wanted to add, as you were saying that on the states and sort of the implications for the enforcement, at the time that 1070 was being ruled on by the Supreme Court, we didn't know in which direction. I recall that giving a talk then about in the H world and the legal employment world, that at that time approximately 30 states legislatures had introduced different worker employment programs, different enforcement regimens in their legislatures ready if the Supreme Court had ruled. And that was on both sides of the political spectrum, more liberal, more conservative. But it is a footnote that if a federal agency is trying to implement that, that is 50 times more complicated if 50 states put in their own, and you still have a federal system in place.
And more work for lawyers. Again,
But then
it's for
again,
immigration
it is a
lawyers,
full employment for decades, actually.
which is not a good solution necessarily.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to open it up to questions now from the audience. It looks like we have people with microphones, so please feel free to ask questions. Maybe raise your hand first.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. One question that some people might have is, what are the challenges or concerns that arise when trying to balance national security issues with protecting the individual rights of those individuals trying to cross the border or the ports of entry?
Well, I think one aspect of this is when someone is encountered, seeking to try to make a rapid determination about their status, about their social status, about their health, about their conditions. I'll take that particularly for a Border Patrol agent. You only have a few minutes to try to determine what's occurring. And I say that because at times that next action could be viewed, depending upon their status, depending on background or demographic, could create a violation or a charge being brought. And so it means the agents are constantly trying to balance that. To your point, it's sort of circular to the question, but in another way, it's that's a very difficult for those officers and agents. But I will say they're mindful of them. And in other words, they're concerned about that. They will ask about the conditions and they will try to find. But we also recognize if you're trying to interdict and you're trying to identify, it's national security first, while trying to balance those rights and privileges that we inure, some to citizens, some not to citizens, some depends upon the interpretation given within a department.
And I think it's hard to divorce immigration policy from moral notions writ large. And I think there are sort of competing impulses on the right side of the political spectrum. Immigration policy is a lot about sort of protection and like this idea that we need order, orderly entry, orderly exit of our borders because doing so allows us to protect our country. On the left, it's more about sort of empathy and compassion, let's say. And I don't think either side is wrong. There's some imperfect combination of those moral responses that will inevitably make its way into whatever immigration policy you have. But I think when you bring up concepts like individual rights, it's hard to sort of have that discussion in strictly policy or legal terms without sort of acknowledging that this is actually also about like broader notions of morality that, you know, people may or may not agree on. I think more practically though, a lot of Americans who are not lawyers have a misunderstanding of what the law says when it comes to a right to immigrate. So asylum, for example, there are very strict criteria to qualify for asylum legally, and the US's criteria are quite different and more stringent than other countries' asylum laws. So for example, if you want a higher paying job and or are impoverished socioeconomically in another country, that's not enough to garner asylum status in the US. Another misconception is, oh, well, a person lives in a country in which there is generalized violence across the board. Surely he or she should get asylum, right? Well, actually, no, because the criteria doesn't say that. Unless the person is being persecuted on account of a protected class, violence writ large in a country is not going to necessarily be your golden ticket to getting asylum. So, when we have these conversations about rights, there needs to be a corresponding discussion about, okay, well, what rights are you actually talking about? And are you talking about like rights in the law, or are you talking about something more abstract, like I was saying, that's more about sort of morality and equitable treatment, humane treatment, and that sort of thing that is not sort of rooted in the law as much as it is sort of in general moral sort of notions.
Thank you all so much for being here. Earlier when you were discussing technology, I was curious if you see AI having any role in this technology in the future, or what that might potentially look like. It seems like that's a conversation we're having with any different, area of the law right now.
We were talking about that before when we were in the green room, and yes, I think very much so. And part from my view, I think, is that the speed and precision which AI technology can give us with respect to screening. By the way, not only as a national security in the element of someone crossing between the border, but also, and we've just announced a pilot program for the department, for ICE to utilize in the detection of forced labor and trafficking. And so it's keeping in mind that the exploding volume means that there's also an enormous amount of data about people that are coming in. And so our ability that we may be able to gather it in different ways and be able to determine and detect and interdict is going to be very valuable, and I think can actually go towards some of the protection of civil rights as well. Again, that diffusion between national security and encounters, and zeroing in on those that we need to be concerned about, as well as those actors like those committing forced labor. But you were mentioning some of your projects, Julie.
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see how far along those pilots can get without litigation, trying to shut them down, and some of the concerns about problems with the large language models and the data that's based on, and so how can you ensure that this is done in a way that doesn't have the wrong kinds of bias and other things. So it's a really interesting time, because I do think that the developments in AI and later AGI have tremendous potential to make us more effective, so we're not wasting time on people that don't pose a threat, and we're only focusing on people that do pose a threat. But while we get there, it'll probably be a little messy. It'll not be perfect, and so there'll probably be a lot of lawsuits. And so again, room for lawyers, lots of opportunity for lawyers. But hopefully we can use it, because I do think it'll make the department better. But I think it'll be really interesting to track these pilots and to see how long they can go before there's challenges to their use.
That's right.
And whether or not what they're doing in the pilots is consistent with the EU AI Act and other things, or whether that would be considered high risk that would then cause an issue for the companies and things. So it's a very complicated and interesting set of issues, but an exciting time.
The
just to
EU
give
Act
one
especially.
Yeah.
To give one concrete example of sort of AI already being a big part of the conversation, just as of a couple weeks ago, an AI company was in my office lobbying on behalf of a voice recognition technology that the company has already contracted with large insurance companies about, and the idea is it can pick up on fraud somehow in people's voices. There are sort of micro signs or something that this technology can detect. And this has broad implications for screening at the border, for example, if someone is making a claim about persecution or what have you, or claims to be somebody, this voice recognition software, as the company puts it, I'm not weighing in for or against, but they say that, the same sort of thing that insurance companies are doing can be applied in a variety of foreign policy and migration contexts. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
And that company has actually approached us.
Oh, really?
We've had some
Yeah.
conversations that, keeping high level, to say part of the ability to implement on a broad scale raises some of the future litigation questions that make it challenging right now. We might have more conversations after, but makes it challenging now. But I think in the evolving AI space, it might be more likely, because it is very intriguing. It's sort of the tenor or timbre of the voice that no matter how much we think that we could lie, and let's hope most of us think we couldn't lie very well, but it just detects regardless, at least in that space.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Right.
So it's a very interesting time.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Going to the state's enforcement question, while there's like larger preemption and constitutional questions, I'm curious if there are kind of lower level legal frameworks to help coordinate and cooperate at some levels, or like how the integration of both federal and state enforcement is taking place. And just curious if there's non-challenged kind of legal frameworks currently being implemented at like a execution standpoint.
Well, I mean, we have a traditional framework of working federal, state, and local, right? 287G is a good example.
Yeah, absolutely. So traditionally, if a state, you could have a 287G where a state or local authorities could make an arrest, and then they would turn the person over to ICE. ICE would make the determination, then they would then go through the process. And 287G, they could do more of the determination themselves. Also in the jails right now, you could have state and local individuals doing some interviewing, not making the determination of whether or not the person is unauthorized, because ICE wants to hold that for themselves,
Right.
but they could refer someone. And so there's a lot of referring that goes on now all over the country in certain cases. The question is, does ICE pick up the phone? Or does DHS pick up the phone? Or are those people, do we want to accept those referrals? A, do they want to accept them? B, do they have the resources to accept all of them? But they're acceptable frameworks. But my hunch, not being in the government, is that some of these new things that states are doing, that the Biden administration may not love them in particular, so they may not want to create great new frameworks and look to see how can we only cooperate for very serious individuals that look like they've committed serious crimes or something else, versus developing a whole new way to cooperate. I'm just guessing, but
I think you know the federal framework pretty well, and I do say to that while we have those traditional frameworks, so for example in Texas, some of the tensions have arisen where the Texas law enforcement have indicated certain areas are off bounds. And so that's made it challenging from the federal side, more so than traditionally in the past. If we were in sort of the indigenous reservations, we have sort of different arrangements. So we do have some frameworks. I think it will be difficult, and I think until the Supreme Court, if they were to rule that Texas were able to implement this, and in fact in language that wasn't particularly narrow to that particular effort, but in fact gave kind of free range, we would be required to work out different apparatus. But I think the actual enforcement of it will be inordinately complicated for when I think about the Border Patrol, for ICE, and I mentioned earlier on the immigration, sort of the worker programs, I half joked but not, that someone who's processing at the port of entry, a customs officer, who then says, now you can go to Idaho, but you can't go to Florida, is going to be far more complicated, right? So it would take a lot, and I think the confusion that it would lead to along the way would take a lot of years to probably sort out. It may sound like that's a talking point I should give, but I think pragmatically would take a lot.
Well, and it's a resource point, too, at the end of the day. So even if the government wanted to fully cooperate with, even just with one state, the amount of resources that it would take would drain the rest of all the agencies. You just wouldn't be able to do it. I was talking with a former ICE agent today, and they were talking about when we were asked to do calculations if you were going to deport 12 million individuals.
right.
This was back during the Secure Border Initiative. And the ICE agent said, my calculator doesn't have that many zeros. I cannot get up that big, can't get up that big. And so the number wouldn't go up that high. And so that is the kind of challenge we
Right.
would be facing. And so then how does then you're back to, okay, the federal government's going to prioritize. They're going to
Right.
choose. Well, that's what they do now, right? They choose, they prioritize. And so I don't know that the states will get to where they want to be. Again, I understand their frustration. We do need reform, but I'm not sure this will get them where they want to go.
And I think one example as well from the resources that struck me is when you see the numbers of the unauthorized estimates, some term that's often used is the gotaways, and that term actually refers to when our agents aren't able to get to everyone, aren't able to encounter. So sometimes they will see when radio in, X number of people are 3 miles or 5 miles away. We can't, or 10, more often 10 to 15, we can't actually get the agents there in time to interdict. So that gives you an example of where the current state is, the current map on resources as well. And that will be exacerbated in this type of regimen.
And I'll just point out, we did talk about 287G in immigration law last night, but there's the element of sanctuary cities. So while we're talking about Texas and states wanting action, there are states and local governments that are almost the opposite. They don't want to work with the federal government on immigration. They want to protect the immigrant community. So there is a bit of a difference over every administration, honestly.
That's right.
And it makes it so hard kind of to do, for the state and locals to do their jobs as well as for the federal enforcement to do their jobs, because people are always then second guessing about the decision about who was protected, who wasn't protected, and who was, nobody wants anybody in the U.S. to be harmed, right? No matter what.
That's
And
right.
so when a bad thing happens and the person who caused the bad thing is unauthorized, they're always looking to see, was this person in the system before? Answer usually is yes. They were usually in the system somewhere before. And then were they turned over to the agency? Were they prosecuted state? Were they prosecuted?
Did they have
for
authority to
immigration?
come
They have
in? Did they
authority.
overstay?
It's not a good situation, which goes back to kind of how can we get control of the number of people that we have in the U.S. And that's the challenge
right.
for Congress for you to
That's right.
for you to solve for
That's
us.
right. And we don't want to underestimate and underappreciate the level of frustration that the states have. I mean, and so that, what I said earlier, is true for the feds. We recognize that, a lot of us recognize that for the states and locals as well. This is sort of being driven by almost a level of such high frustration to desperation to, we need to change this, that they're willing to sail into the federal government and into the courts to try to get a different solution.
I have a question. Thank you. When we talk about the border crisis, we often refer exclusively to the southern border. And as a Canadian American, I have to ask, to what extent is there a border crisis in our northern border?
So are you familiar with Roxham Road? Okay.
That's a
so
no.
that's so in Canada, there's a particular area on our northern border, Roxham Road, which is, best way to describe it is literally a road through a town that you can just cross into that. There's really not border security there. And for many years, despite that being relatively open, we would say, compared to the southern border of the United States, few people crossed there. Some did. They would seek asylum. And in the Canadian system, as soon as you cross, I think it's like for us, it's like 3 or 4 feet into Canadian territory, you can request asylum. And now in the last, I think it was in the last year, they've had triple the amount or more. And it's still, when you compare it to the southern border, it's in tens of thousands. So for the United States, we kind of have to measure ourselves, I think, in the discussions with the Canadian government, because on one hand, the volumes are much bigger, sure, for the US, but for Canada, it's a significant issue, and such that as well, they've recently had their asylum documents that you can, like our employee authorization documents that you can receive. Generally, you'd receive it within a couple of weeks. They're now starting to slip into what we've faced for many years, which is 8 months, 9 months, and so someone's in limbo. So now so it's an increasing concern, Because of some of the concerns on the southern border, people are utilizing the northern border. Our Canadian counterparts are very concerned about that. It's part of how we renegotiated the Safe Third agreement we have with them to try to address in part.
It's not just people coming through the northern border. Drugs are increasingly a
Right.
problem. So a lot of our conversations with Canada right now hinge on fentanyl and how it, it's no longer a Mexico/China/US problem. It's also a Canadian problem because there have been increased seizures up there.
Great. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys so much for being a part of this.
Thank you.
I know that for those of us in the room, I believe there's food for us. So I'll turn it back over to the National Security Law Journal so they can explain where that is. But yeah, thank you guys so much for being here.
Thanks
Thank
for
you very
hosting
much
us.
for
Thank
hosting
you.
us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for our moderator and for our panelists for being here tonight. If everyone would like, we have a small reception in the art gallery right behind this auditorium, and all are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great discussion. That was fun. Yeah.